chair tonight's program. And with that, I'd like to introduce Director Chris Kramer.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank everybody for coming tonight. And we know it's a beautiful evening, and so we're going to get right into the programming. So we are so pleased to partner with the World Food Prize Foundation here at this beautiful building. As Kate mentioned, my name is Chris Kramer, and I'm the director of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs. And that includes the State Historical Society of Iowa, the State Historic Preservation Office, who is very helpful in the restoration of this beautiful building into what it is today, as well as the Iowa Arts Council, the state's film office, Produce Iowa State Office of Film and Media Production, and we are also the interim Iowa Humanities Council, which makes it very appropriate for us to partner with the World Food Prize on this new offering. And we actually began our planning for this project last fall. And we reached out to Ambassador Branstad and said, you know, there was a book that came out, and we felt like it was such an important topic for us to explore the farm prices and the leadership that was provided by then Lieutenant Governor and then Governor Terry Branstad, and for us to look back and learn from this unique opportunity. So we started working on an oral history project and recording that, and then that leads to today. So now he's in place here, and Ambassador Branstad is here at the World Food Prize. And always, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and we also were able to collaborate with the previous president, Ambassador Ken Quinn. Our departments collaborated on the statue at Statuary Hall, Norman E. Borlaug statue that's placed there, and that's actually part of the State Historical Society of Iowa's collection, which you may or may not know. And Ambassador Quinn is amazing with helping us, got amazing access to that facility. Which was the U.S. Capitol, I should say, like no one else. So we are so excited to collaborate. The State Historical Society recognizes so many important stories about our past, but certainly with regard to Iowa's place as an agricultural state and very much a rural state. And so telling the story of rural life is really central to Iowa's story. And since Iowa joined the Union in 1846, Iowa has been a leading agricultural state. And so many of us, including Ambassador Branstad, have meaningful and personal ties to agriculture in Iowa. So the stories we tell, preserve, and collect about agriculture in rural America are Iowa stories. And we are privileged to tell the stories of hardworking men, women, and children. Tonight's conversation builds on a project that began last fall, as I mentioned, and we hope the beginning of one of many projects. I'd also just like to recognize a couple of other people that helped make that happen. Certainly, State Historical Society of Iowa Administrator Susan Claver, who's here tonight, State Archivist Tony Jan, and you're going to meet Andrew Plump from our team in the State Historical Society, who is also the editor of the Annals of Iowa. And he's already refreshing that. We've been using Iowa artists to depict different life in Iowa, and have already had a couple of agricultural covers on the covers of those of the Annals of Iowa that's been in existence for almost as long as Iowa has been. So although the farm crisis still evokes powerful memories and emotions among many Iowans, the height of the crisis was nearly 40 years ago. And now books about the crisis appear in the history section rather than current events. Enough time has passed that historians are beginning to write the farm crisis into the history books, making sure that the stories and experiences of Iowans who lived through the crisis are preserved in future generations. So we are honored to do this work. In an effort to spark even more conversation about the farm crisis, we've also featured an extended excerpt of Ambassador Branstad's oral history of the farm crisis in the spring issue of the Annals of Iowa. We do have some copies available tonight. The issue also includes a scholarly discussion of the very first history of the farm crisis in Iowa, farm crisis-related photos and letters from the Historical Society Special Collections and State Archives in Des Moines. several of which were on display upstairs earlier tonight, and we're also developing a guide for K through 12 educators on how to teach about the farm crisis with primary sources. Issues are available tonight, as I mentioned, and even though this is a topic that is hard to discuss, but talking about the farm crisis is important. Capturing and telling these stories is important, and you all being here tonight is the beginning of that. So we're so thankful for how we can all explore this topic together. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest of honor, and as well as his interviewer. Former U.S. Ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, assumed leadership of the World Food Prize Foundation in January of 2023, bringing to the organization a legacy of public service, executive leadership, and coalition building on an international scale. He's had an important connection to food and agriculture throughout his career, including leading the state of Iowa through much of the 1980s farm crisis and rebuilding the state's economy, where agriculture drives many employment sectors. Ambassador Branstad also holds the record as the longest serving governor in the history of the United States. He held office of governor of Iowa from 1983 until 1999, and then again from 2011 until 2017, when he was appointed as the U.S. Ambassador to China. In 2022, he was named Ambassador in Residence at Drake University in Des Moines, where he received his Juris Doctorate, and in addition to his role as president, was also served as the president of Des Moines University's medical school. So his public service also includes election to the office of Lieutenant Governor and 3 terms in the Iowa House of Representatives. Born and raised in Leland, Iowa, Ambassador Branstad graduated from Forest City High School and received a bachelor's degree from the University of Iowa, and he and his wife Chris have 3 adult children and 8 grandchildren. So tonight, Ambassador Branstad will be interviewed by Andrew Klump, the editor of the Annals of Iowa, part of the State Historical Society of Iowa, and Dr. Klump is a native of Sanborn, Iowa, in northwest Iowa, and he earned his bachelor's degree at Northwestern College in Orange City, before continuing his education with earning a master's at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and his PhD at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. We very happily welcomed him back home as he happily returned home to Iowa to join the State Historical Society in 2020. So now it is my pleasure to turn over the program to these wonderful gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Director Kramer and Ambassador Branstad, for being here. We're delighted, and you're all here to hear, and to hear this, and we're so grateful that you joined us tonight. So I thought we would just get started. We're here to listen and hear your stories, and so I wanted to open it up with you. If you have anything to start with, otherwise I'll start with questions, but it seems like you want to jump in.
Well, Chris Kramer, I think, told my whole life story. Anyway, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I am a farm kid from northern Iowa, and, I guess growing up on a farm and learning all the responsibility that goes with that prepared me for as well as anything could, I guess, for the challenges of being governor during the farm crisis of the 80s. But it was a gut-wrenching, challenging time, and I look forward to answering questions that Andrew has or that the audience has, but it's still pretty fresh on my mind because living through that experience is something you don't forget. Let's go ahead.
Absolutely. Wonderful. And as the ambassador said, we'll start off with some questions from me, but we will have time to answer questions from you all as well. So in about a half hour, we'll open up for questions from the audience. I'll repeat those questions so that everyone can hear, so that would be how we'll go forward. But we'll start off with a few questions of our own. And I thought we'd start at the beginning. You were newly elected governor in the 80s, early 80s, and I wonder, as you were watching this farm crisis start to unfold, when did you start to realize that something extraordinary was happening in Iowa?
Well, you know, in the 1970s, we had a period of tremendous inflation, and people were buying farmland just to try to get ahead of inflation. Then, in the early 80s, it started to change, and commodity prices dropped, and unfortunately, a lot of people had bought farmland or bought machinery with borrowed money, or even on loans that could accelerate. So it was not a fixed set interest rate, but an interest rate that could be adjusted. And then the Federal Reserve decided they were going to solve the inflation problem. We think we've got a big inflation problem today. It was even worse in the early 80s. And Volcker was in charge of the Federal Reserve, and he was committed to control inflation with high interest rates. And that was just devastating, especially to young people or families that had bought land or brought in a new family member into the farming operation and done it with a variable interest rate or any kind of borrowed money. Land values literally dropped in my first term as governor, 83, 4, 5, and 6. Land values dropped 63%, and we closed 38 banks. One of those banks was uninsured. And we all think of FDIC insurance, and we just saw that, well, FDIC insurance only goes to $250,000. I remember when it was $100,000, but the problem was we had 4 banks in Iowa that were grandfathered in back when FDIC insurance started, and so the depositors were not protected. And one of those was in Bloomfield, Iowa, and it went under. And of course, we literally changed the law then to require all banks to be FDIC insured. But I was governor, and I had been in the legislature. I'd been lieutenant governor, and I didn't think there was such a thing as a non-insured bank, but it happened. And then I remember the superintendent of banking, Tom Houston, from Columbus Junction. He used to come to me on Friday and tell me what banks they were going to close over the weekend. And then they try to sell it over the weekend, reopen it. So it was a gut-wrenching period of time. And a lot of farmers, of course, were in real financial trouble. And it wasn't just farmers, it was farm machinery dealers. It was a lot of small-town businesses as well.
And one of the things I appreciated when we were doing our oral history was your memories of some of the people and the stories. Could you share some of those, some of the people whose stories of the farm crisis have stuck with you all these years?
Well, one of the most gut-wrenching was there was a farmer from Hills, Iowa, killed his neighbor, killed his wife, and killed his banker, which was John Hughes, and then killed himself. And John Hughes was a very nice guy, a good banker, Hills Bank, and his daughter had babysat for us. We did it my first year as governor, these mini vacations where I take my family and go out to see the sites around Iowa. And on one of those, we stayed in Coralville, and John Hughes' daughter babysat for my children. And also, his brother, Gary Hughes, happened to be the Johnson County Sheriff, and he was the bodyguard for Hayden Fry. So things were pretty close to, and then I remember going to Bloomfield, Iowa. Jim Leach was the congressman, and he and I met with a group of farmers. I think it's in Davis County. I think it was over 700 of them. And you know, it was a crop failure, and we were there at the it was at where they had the County Fair. The County Fairgrounds. And they presented us with briefs showing what the corn would really look like. And it was pretty graphic. I remember taking it back to my office, displaying it. And then I went to all 99 counties every year I was governor. So I traveled the state, and I got an earful a lot of times, and I got a lot of letters from people all ages, even some children that expressed the stress their families were going through because of the farm crisis, and they were losing the farm, and people of all ages. But one year, when I presented the condition of the state address, the entire gallery was filled with people carrying white crosses to symbolize the death of the family farm. And of course, I grew up on a family farm, and I had a dad and brother who were farming, and I had bought farmland myself, so I personally felt what people were going through. But it was a very difficult and very heart-wrenching time.
So as you were traveling the state, listening and hearing and experiencing the farm crisis, could you talk a little bit about how you then began to try to decide what the best action was, or how you would lead the state through such a difficult time?
Well, some of you remember Bill Murray, who started Living History Farms. He was at Iowa State back during the farm crisis of the 1920s and 30s. You think of the Depression of the 30s, but agriculture was going through a depression in the 20s, even before then. And so I called him in, and I said, what did you do during that farm crisis back in the 20s and 30s? Well, and he suggested that we look at restructuring agriculture debt, string it out so people have longer time to pay it back. So if they could pay interest, they at least wouldn't have their farm foreclosed on. And that was one of the good ideas. We started something called the Rural Concern Hotline. And I remember the last 4 digits were 1985, because that's the year we started. And so people would call in and get advice on, and it might be mental issues, it might be issues involving finance and everything like that. But we started the Rural Concern Hotline. We also, then there was a lot of pressure to do, there was a 1939 law that permitted the governor to have a farm foreclosure moratorium. And I asked Dale Harrell at Iowa State, and I asked a lot of other experts what that would do, and they suggested that that would probably make things worse if we did a full foreclosure moratorium. But if we put in place a moratorium that only applied if they couldn't make the principal payments, they could make the interest payment. So I put in place a partial moratorium that prohibited foreclosures if the interest rates were being paid. And then one of the most unusual things we did, Bob Pym was the director of the Farmers Home Administration, which is a federal program, and they had a program to provide loan guarantees. So a lot of banks were, because things were going down and they weren't willing to provide loans to farmers unless they could get a loan guarantee. And Farmers Home was so bureaucratic and slow that they weren't getting the job done. So I used the emergency powers that I had under the disaster to activate the Iowa National Guard to take over the Farmers Home Administration. And we got 30% of all the loan guarantees in the whole nation came to Iowa. And I'm sure it was probably illegal to have the State National Guard take over a federal agency. But Bob Kim let us do it. He knew that they weren't able to do it. And Tommy Thompson was the deputy director of the National Guard, and he was in charge of that program. And by gosh, we got 30% of all the loan guarantees. We helped save thousands of farms because of that. So that was one of the more innovative things we did. The legislature passed a law that they call the minimum pricing law that would have made it illegal to sell corn or soybeans below a certain price. Well, the price was nowhere near that. And so that was a great way to get attention, but it would have been a disaster because it would have closed down all of the food processing plants in Iowa. You know, like ADM or General Mills or you name it, Cargill. And so I vetoed it. And that took a lot of courage because they were out on the steps of the Capitol beating the drums and demanding it be signed. But I vetoed it. And because my feeling was this, I was willing to do about anything to help, but not something just to get attention that could be counterproductive. So that's the way. And the other thing we did, just as we were trying to, with empathy, address the issues and doing these town hall meetings all across the state, we were working to diversify the Iowa economy and add value to agriculture. And we were able to, this is where we got started in promoting ethanol, biodiesel, and wind energy. And look where that's gone in Iowa today. It's made a really big difference. And then we also, during that period of time, we got rid of the tax on machinery and equipment, which was really important because major manufacturing was just being clobbered because of this annual property tax. So we eliminated it for new equipment and then we phased it out for the existing. So there were a lot of things we did. We did not just address the stress and the problems of the farm crisis. We also made changes in public policy to make Iowa more competitive in terms of attracting quality jobs. And one of the things we did, insurance and financial services, we reduced the insurance premium tax. I looked around and I said, Des Moines still doing pretty well, the rest of the state is hurting. Why is that? Well, it's the Principal Financial Group is hiring about 500 new employees every year. And so we thought, what if we try to make Iowa even more attractive insurance state? And that change did make a difference. Helped a lot of insurance investments in part, not just in Des Moines, but throughout the state.
It's always striking to hear all the things you were doing in Iowa during the crisis to make things better and to help and to build a future. I wonder if you could talk a little bit too about what you were doing nationally, the advocacy you were doing. I think that was another thing that really struck me about your story of the crisis was the advocacy work you did on behalf of Iowans.
Well, I've been a Reagan supporter, and of course he was president, and then he was going to run for re-election in 1984. They wanted to come to the Iowa State Fair, and I said, don't come to the Iowa State Fair until you have a debt restructuring plan. Well, so he didn't come to the Iowa State Fair because I knew he'd catch all kinds of hell. But then he did announce they were going to do debt restructuring, and he came to eastern Iowa, the John Brockchink farm, and they had a great event over there in the John Brockchink farm, and then he went to Winterset right before the election on a Saturday of the Iowa-Wisconsin football game, so I had to leave at halftime to go to the Reagan event in Winterset. But, so he made that commitment. But then in January, when I go in for the inauguration, I brought with Superintendent of Banking and Neil Harrell. So I brought with those two experts, and we had a map of the state of Iowa. And we circled every town that had a banking trouble. And we met with David Stockman, who was head of OMB, in the Roosevelt room of the White House. I'll never get it. And he said, I don't care what the president promised you, we're not going to do it. Well, needless to say, I was pretty angry. And by the time the meeting was over, they said I threw a chair at him. I didn't really throw a chair at him. I just strongly pushed that chair under the table and insisted that we're going to continue to fight for agriculture debt restructuring. And it did get done. President Reagan signed debt restructuring in December of 1987. It should have been done in 85. So we went through 2 more years of stress. But, and I got to say, I was even taking on the farm credit system because they were foreclosing on farmers, some of their best borrowers. It made no sense. why were they doing that? And the only thing I could say was, they're trying to save the system at the expense of the reservoir. And so that's why we needed debt restructuring at the federal level as well as state level. So it was a gut-wrenching time, and I'll never forget, and I want to give some real credit to Keith Heffernan, who was my agriculture guy at the time, and also Steve Berger. Steve went to Iowa State, did an internship with us, and then after a year after he graduated, stayed on before he went back home to start farming. But those two were very instrumental on my staff in answering those questions and developing a lot of the plans we came up with to address the farm crisis. And I appreciate that, and you know, it was really gut-wrenching, some of the letters we got. We tried to answer them all, and we tried to be empathetic but realistic in what could be done.
Yeah, I actually was reading some of those. Some of those letters are upstairs and are in this special issue, and every single one in our archives had an answer to it that I found. You know, so they did. Everybody got an answer.
In addition to the letters, we had a lot of town hall meetings and opportunities for people to share their concerns. And I think that went a long way. Even though in some cases we weren't able to do a lot, we needed to show empathy and a willingness to try to examine all different alternatives. And the Rural Concern Hotline, I think, also helped because it gave people an outlet and a place where they could go and get advice.
I was very struck when we chatted last fall to hear your stories about listening to and going and talking to people. You didn't just stay in Des Moines, but you really were out there, but also then giving them realistic advice in their emergency situations. I thought that was really striking to hear that kind of philosophy and that approach to navigating such a tough time.
Well, I think it's very important to be hands-on and to be very honest with people, and that's what we tried to do. And I found that people would sometimes didn't always agree with me, but they always would say that I was honest and sincere. And that went a long ways, I think, in reassuring people that the governor cared and was willing to examine different options and alternatives and try to be as proactive as I felt I could be in a constructive way, not just to get attention. Because there were a lot of people who were trying to get attention and doing, you know, kind of crazy radical things. We wanted to do constructive things that would be helpful.
So when you look back, what do you look back and look at as maybe some of your biggest accomplishments, or the things that you look back at the farm crisis and say, I'm glad you really pursued that. I think it made a really big difference. I know you probably mentioned some of them, but just think about them in that context.
Well, one of the things that we started during that time was the investment in biotech research at Iowa State University. And Ted Crosby, who at that time was at Iowa State, and he was one of the professors that came to me and said, you ought to invest in biotech research. I went to San Francisco and I met with Bob Noyce, who was the inventor of the computer chip, and he's a graduate of Cornell. And I asked him, now he's in microelectronics, what do you think we ought to be doing in Iowa? He said, biotechnology. So we came up with, and this is at the depth of the farm crisis when the state didn't have a lot of money. We had the 3x5 program. We increased funding for biotech research at Iowa State, $5 million a year for 3 straight years. And we built a biotech research facility there. We also, and it took a little while to get this done, I had to get a new president of Iowa State, Gordon Eaton, to finally go along with it, but we started the research park at Iowa State and the University of Iowa. And that research park has now been so successful, it's been expanded, and it's really making a difference. And then another thing that happened later on was John Papajohn came up with the idea of the entrepreneurial centers. And he approached me as governor to fly around with him and announce entrepreneurial centers at the University of Iowa, Iowa State, Drake, UNI, and North Iowa Area Community College in Mason City, where he grew up. And those have been in existence now for over 25 years. They made a real difference. There's a lot more young people that are interested in starting their own business and being entrepreneurs. And so the combination of all of those things, I think, have made a difference. Now today, look where we are. Farmland now is at a record high, not a record low that we went through. And the state of Iowa is in the best financial position it's ever been in history. I think over $3 billion surplus. And they've already eliminated the tax on retirement benefits and going to a flat 3.9% income tax. So those things would not have been possible if we hadn't planted the seeds and started to focus on diversifying the Iowa economy and adding value to agriculture that we did back during the farm crisis.
And I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for questions for everyone. So be thinking if you have questions. But the question I want to ask is, what would you say to people who, are future historians or young people today? What lessons would you want them to learn when they look at the farm crisis, or what lessons did you learn that you'd want to pass on to young people or to a next generation of farmers? What are the lessons of the farm crisis that you want to share?
Well, first of all, this is the thing that you have to remind people is, it's not your fault. If land values drop 63%, I don't care how good a farmer you are, you're not going to make it under those circumstances. So a lot of people did lose their farms, and a lot of people had to go into other things because of it. But they needed to know that they were the victim of the circumstances. They were, the inflationary period in the 70s led to the Federal Reserve controlling inflation with extremely high interest rates, and a lot of people. Now the good news is I think both lenders and farmers learned a lesson. We don't have near the debt load now that we had then, because I think people learned that you don't want to buy land on variable interest rates, and you don't want to buy land based on the assumption that it's going to cost a lot more next year. Now that's been the case in the last few years, but we just don't have a lot of people that are buying land based on presumption it's going to get more expensive and they can make money by borrowing more money. So I would say one of the big lessons of the farm crisis is be careful and avoid debt. A limited amount of debt for a very good reason can work for you, but it can be a real problem. I have some friends who used to live in Boone County, and the Fairways Company, the family that owns that, they never build a store unless they can pay cash. And there's very few businesses that have that attitude, but I tell you, it's worked for them. Because they're not open on Sunday either, so they're doing a lot of things different. But the Beckwiths own the Fairway stores. And you may know that Sue Beckwith is one of the big contributors to the University of Iowa women's basketball program. She's a doctor from here in Des Moines. Okay?
Yeah. So we'll have opportunity for questions from the audience. I saw this hand first, so I'll remind you. You'll say your question. I'm going to repeat it so that we get it on the recording. And then we'll pass it off to the ambassador.
Ambassador, thank you. As you know, I'm an consulate.
Right.
And despite being a physician and someone from New York City, I was always very interested in the farm, the agricultural industry in Iowa. And I actually wrote and lobbied to get past the Farm to School bill, which was a very successful bipartisan bill.
Yeah.
First in the country. My question has two predicates. One predicate is that we lost a whole generation of farmers during the farm crisis, and that led to a large percentage of Iowa's farmland being gobbled up by large agribusiness. And and this is kind of creating a new farm crisis that we have in Iowa. Not as many small farms as there were in the 70s and 80s. And what do you think the solutions to that is?
Well, first of all, you need to know, and a lot of people don't realize this, we don't permit foreign ownership or corporate ownership of farmland in Iowa. Only family farm corporations can own farmland in the state, and that's been the law since the 70s. Now, there's no question that the size of farms have gotten bigger. Part of that is because the equipment has gotten so much bigger, and one family can now operate a bigger operation. For instance, I grew up on a small family farm, and we farmed about 300 acres. Our farm and my grandmother's farm that was next to us, and we bought another 80, and then we did custom hay baling and stuff like that. My brother is deceased, my father is deceased. I have 3 nephews that have all come back to the farm. They have got land from my dad, they got land from my brother, and they bought land. They are now, and they're renting land. They're now farming 4,500 acres, and they have they're farming 3,500 acres. They have about 4,500 in a cattle. Much different than when I was a kid. We had a very diversified operation. We had cattle, sheep, chickens, hogs, and we did custom work. So it's just changed that much. But the other thing that I think is encouraging about modern agriculture in Iowa is people have become very more concerned about pollution and protecting the soil from erosion, and so precision farming has become a much bigger deal in preventing the overuse of chemicals and fertilizers by putting on just as much as needed and putting a uniform amount on everywhere. So I don't think you're going to really practice that farming, but there's also niche opportunities. Look at all the wineries we have in Iowa now. And you can, on a very small amount of land, raise grapes and have a winery. And in fact, that's become tourism attractions as well. And so, I think we need to recognize that things are always going to change. We just have to be willing to adapt and adjust to those changes and look for opportunities along the way.
And for those on the recording, the question was about the growth and size of farms, essentially, and what the perspective on that was in relation to the crisis. So we'll move to the next question here.
Governor, from where I sat, the toughest decision we made that first year, 1983, was to raise the sales tax. You got in there and discovered state finances were not what they needed to be. Talk a little bit about how you went about doing that, because I may be wrong, but I think maybe you campaigned against the sales tax increase.
Well, I didn't want any tax increase.
Right.
But I got to be governor, and I found out how bad the finances of the state were, and if we were going to be able to make our commitment to schools, and if we were going to reduce our dependency on property taxes for the court system, we needed to do something. And so it took a lot of courage, but in the budget message, I think I've been governor a week, I got up there and recommended a sales tax increase. Because the Democrats controlled the legislature, and they were delighted. They sped up so I knew it would be tough, but the Democrats were in control of the legislature, and they quickly passed the sales tax increase. Instead of having it take effect July 1, I think it made it April 1. But it made it possible for us to begin the process of eliminating the counties paying for the cost of the court system. So I think we phased that over 3 years, and we were able to keep our commitments to the school aid, which we otherwise could not have afforded to do. So it was one of those things, and even with the change, our sales tax was still pretty competitive with other states. If you compare the taxes in Iowa, the one that's the most hated is the property tax. Next is the income tax. The least hated is the sales tax. And of course, I think it's critically important that we be very prudent and careful with the way we spend our money so you don't have to raise taxes. But in that time we were in the farm crisis period, if we were going to really make our commitments to education and reduce our dependency on property tax, I didn't see any other alternative. And indeed, like I said, the Democrats controlled the legislature. They were very pleased that the Republican governor recommended it, and they passed it. I think most of the Republicans voted against it, but nevertheless, you know, that's the other thing I learned is when you're governor, you've got to work with the legislature, whichever party's in control. And I always tried to work with the legislature. There were times that we disagreed, and like I said, they passed this minimum pricing bill, which I vetoed because I thought it was bad policy, and it would really, if you put it in place, would have really cost a lot of jobs in food processing. And that would have made things worse instead of better. But you have to evaluate each issue on its merits, and I think that was the right thing to do at that time.
And the question there was about sales, the decision to push for a sales tax increase early in your governorship for those watching the recording. I saw a hand in the back. Yeah.
What was your experience visiting all 99 counties? Did you, like the logistics, did you go to the capitals, I mean the county seats? Did people line up to see you, give a speech? I mean, that's what's fascinating to me, to visit all 99 counties. We did it so many times.
Well, I'm not the only one that's done that. But you want to answer?
Yeah, I'm just going to say it out loud because I think people might have had a hard time hearing. The question was, how did you go about visiting all 99 counties? What were just the logistics of doing all that visiting?
There's 365 days in the year. And my scheduler was Bonnie Smalley. She scheduled my life for my campaign for governor and 16 years as governor. And I told her we're going to go to all 99 counties. And we got a lot of invitations. We visited a lot of schools. We visited a lot of business and industry. We went to county fairs. We did a whole lot of different things. And we didn't go just to the county seat towns. We went to communities of all sizes. In fact, I found this out. The people in the most rural areas that never see the governor appreciate it the most when you come to their community. So that going to every county, I think, was, and Chuck Grassley's done that, of course. Every year he's been in the Senate as well. And I think Governor Reynolds is continuing to do that as well. So, and this is a state that's 99 counties. It's a big rural state, and the people from those remote areas that don't get much attention appreciate it the most. I even talked to Governor DeSantis about that. Florida's a very much of an urban. He goes to every county in Florida, and he told me, boy, they really appreciate it when you come to the smaller counties that don't get much attention. So I'm not the only one that knows that secret.
Other questions?
Regarding our nation's relationship with China, can you describe your knowledge of where it's come from and what your crystal ball says for the future regarding the importance?
That's a great question.
So the question is about the United States' relationship with China, where it's been and where the ambassador may see it going.
John Comfort wrote a book. It's called The Beautiful Land in the Middle Kingdom. That's the way the Chinese, the beautiful land is the way they describe America, and they describe China as the Middle Kingdom. It tells the whole history of the relationship between China and the United States from 1776 to 2016. There's been a lot of ups and downs through that period of time. And a part of that time, we were very isolated. In fact, and of course, during China, you know, is a country that's got a 5,000-year written history. During most of that history, they were ruled by dynasties and emperors. And the Chinese look at the emperor as being gifted by heaven, can virtually do no wrong. So a lot of the Chinese people look at Xi Jinping as just the latest emperor. And so they don't question anything he does. And even though they have a communist or authoritarian system now, a lot of the Chinese people, I think, still look at it the way they always have. He's our emperor, and you know, what he says goes. Now, there's been some really positive times in our history. During World War II, they were being attacked by Japan, and we had a group called the Flying Tigers. It was a group of American airmen that volunteered to go over and fight for the Chinese. There was one guy from Marion, Iowa, named Bill Reed. He shot down maybe as many Japanese planes as anybody. He's considered a great hero over there. I went to, I think, 7 different memorials in China to the Flying Tigers. And I met in Yunnan province with a group of Chinese veterans that had worked, and these people were in their late 80s or 90s, and they had worked with the Flying Tigers. That luncheon that we had with them was one of the most emotional meetings my wife and I ever had while we were in China. And we also went to where Chinook, who was the leader, where he was headquartered, they had a cave and everything, but and there's a book that was given to me at one of those memorials about the Flying Tigers and about Bill Reed. And Bill Reed, by the way, was from Marion, Iowa. He graduated from what is now Loras College. He volunteered and served there. And then they got done with that mission. He came back. He helped raise money for war bonds. They had a big parade in Marion. The governor, which was George Wilson, the mayor of Marion, and they all did tributes to him, and he did a lot to raise money for war bonds. And then he re-enlisted and went back over there in the Army Air Corps, and he was shot down and killed in December of 1944. But that, I was given that book before it was even published, and I donated it to the Gold Star Museum at Camp Dodge. But it's a great book, and I will say the respect that they have for the people that were part of the Flying Tigers is something that the Chinese people really appreciate. And I will say this about the Chinese people. I love the Chinese people. They have a great work ethic. They're very committed to education. They're very family oriented. Unfortunately, they're stuck with an authoritarian communist government, and there's a tremendous amount of personal surveillance on people that they don't dare say anything critical, because if they do, under their social scoring, they'll not be able to go on a high-speed train or go on an airplane or get a visa. So, and the Communist Party continually takes takes credit for all the economic improvements that have been made in China. And I will say, today China is a very rich country. Now, my wife and I are Catholic, and we'd go to Mass at the British Embassy, but we would drive by car dealerships for Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Rolls Royce. You don't see many of those in Iowa. But you saw a lot of them in the cities in Eastern China.
Yeah, right here.
Vice Ambassador. I'm very fortunate meet you multiple times during your vice city Beijing. I still remember my first time about my second season.
Yes.
You the Iowa government book. And my question is, what's your most pleasant memory and most difficult challenges for your work and for your daily life in China?
Well, this is Swallow Young that asked the question. He's the head of the Chinese Association here in Iowa, and he's taken more pictures of me than anybody else in the world, including my family. And he even put a book together when I went over there to China. One of the things that was most enjoyable was we took the whole family. Now, my daughter was teaching at the International School of Beijing, her and her husband and two granddaughters. We took them to the ice festival in Harbin. So they carve ice out of the river and they build these big castles out of ice. So we went up there in January, but it was wonderful. And it was the party secretary for Heilongjiang province had been the governor of Hebei, and I'd been the governor that signed the sister state with the previous governor of Hebei. He pulled out all stops. They stopped traffic and everything for us. It was unbelievable. And we had a wonderful time. But it was so cold at the ice festival that my wife and the consul general from our consul up there in northern China, his name was May, his wife and my wife got lost from our group, and we couldn't find them. And it was so cold that the cell phones froze, so we couldn't get all of my cell phones, so we had to announce over the loudspeaker that we were looking for them. But anyway, the grandchildren really enjoyed it. One of the things they had was my granddaughters had never been skiing, and they had a little indoor ski place, which was warmer than it was outdoors, and they got a chance to go skiing there. I'll just never get when I told them, well, we have to go. They started crying, they didn't want to leave. But another thing that we did, my oldest granddaughter, when we first got there, wanted to go to Disney in Shanghai. And so we did that. Very hot, but we had a special escort, and that was a great experience for them. And they really enjoyed their time there until COVID shut down travel, and then they were being tested for, they had to be tested every day, and so finally my daughter taught there for 5 years, but moved on and applied to an international school in Singapore, so they're now all in Singapore. But and one of the things that we had is, we had Chinese drivers, and well, the State Department wanted, they had an ambassador that got slashed in South Korea, so they wanted every ambassador to have security. And we'd never had security for ambassadors in China before. And first of all, the last thing they want is something bad to happen to the American ambassador. So I said, no, I don't want it. And I had to, in writing, reject it. It would have cost hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars to train unarmed Chinese to travel with me. And then when we go up to visit the daughter and son-in-law and grandchildren, they'd have to be along with the driver. And I just said no. And I saved the government a lot of money. But the drivers got to be really good friends. And one of the drivers invited us to a Chinese New Year celebration with his family. And that was really quite an experience. I don't know if you've ever been to one of those big Chinese meals where they have Lazy Susan and they have all the different food and everything. And it was not just him and his immediate family. He had, I think, brothers and sisters and all kinds of people that were there. But anyway, I really appreciate the friendliness and the hospitality that we enjoyed when we were there. And even Xi Jinping, when I presented my credentials to him, he said he had seen the press conference when we arrived, And he said, I would like to host you and your whole families here in China. My wife and I would like to host you for dinner. And on January 30th of 2018, he did that. And that was quite an experience. And my granddaughters have been learning some Mandarin, so they sang a little poem for him, and that was a big hit. And he had staff that kind of entertained them during the meal. His daughter was also there. And his daughter was 25 at that time. She'd gone to Harvard, so we wanted to try now and find a little more about her, but every question that we asked his daughter, his wife answered. So they wanted to protect her identity, and I know that she got a master's degree from Peking University after she came back, but that's about all we learned. We didn't get to find out where she was working or what she was doing. But anyway, that was the experience that we had there.
So what's the most difficult or challenging for this conference?
Well, of course, COVID started in Wuhan when we were there. And it was very frustrating because we had people from the CDC that were at the embassy. And we were offering to help, but they wouldn't return the phone calls. And so that was one of the biggest challenges. And then, of course, President Trump felt that he was lied to. They told him everything's under control, and it wasn't. And then he felt that he got blamed for a lot of things because of the Chinese not leveling with him. And so that was a challenge. One of the other things we went through was the closing of the consulate in Houston. And this is something that Mike Pompeo wanted to do. And I kept telling them, they'll retaliate. They'll close one of our consulates. And I was concerned it could be Guangzhou or it could be Hong Kong. And we had a lot of sophisticated stuff in Guangzhou and Hong Kong. But my staff person, the political staff person said no. The Chinese will want to, they will retaliate in a proportional way. So they'll close Chengdu. And sure enough, we got notified that, so now we had evacuated 1,300 people, Americans, and their families back to the United States, but we still were operating the embassy and the consulates. So I had to call the consul general in Chengdu and say, I know you were set to go back to the United States and your family's already been back there for 6 months, but you need to stay and oversee the closing of the consulate. He said, would you call my wife and tell her? So I called his wife and told her, you know, I was the ambassador, I was the chief of the mission, so that was my responsibility. And anyway, so that was one of the low points. But it was quite an experience. It's I think much more difficult for Nick Burns as the ambassador now because of the balloon incident and the stuff that's happened with Taiwan. He's not getting the opportunity to travel like I did. He's not getting some of the meetings. And I think because of my having hosted Xi Jinping when he came to America the first time, I got treated probably better than a lot of American ambassadors have been treated.
That was during the climate crisis.
Yeah, he was here 1985. The picture in my office was taken April 29, 1985. And Luca Baroni was assigned to take him all over the state. He stayed with the Dvorak family in Muscatine. And so I served 16 years as governor. Then I came back in 2011 to go to China. Normally I meet with the governor of Hubei or the party secretary of Hubei. I get to meet with Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People. He has his itinerary from the 85 trip. And he goes into all this detail about all these people. He mentions by name, Luca Baroni, Sarah Landy, the Dvorak family, much he loved Iowa, and he calls his old friends. So, you know, personal relationships are really important. And we have a lot of Iowans, because that sister state is now 40 years, we have a lot of Iowans that have built some long-lasting friendships with the Bay in particular. And they are building the Kimberly Friendship Farm in a Bay. The difference is the Kimberly Farm here in Iowa has no mountains in the back.
Well, we're at about 6:30. Do you have time for a question or two more?
We're gonna take a couple more.
Couple more, okay. I see
Well,
one here.
I was
Yeah.
going to ask about the Iowa farm that you established there, and that's the Kimberly farm, isn't
It's
it?
the Kimberly Farm.
And you were doing equipment and all of that and teaching them how to farm. Is that still going?
Well, yes, although I haven't been there for a while. I was there for the groundbreaking in 2017. Rick Kimberly has been there several times. Luca Baroni has played a role in that as well. And so that is ongoing.
Okay.
But I'm probably not quite up to speed on it as I should be. But yeah, the Kimberly Friendship Farm, it's on the other side of the Great Wall, but it's still in Bay Province.
Perfect. Well, you were mentioning your opportunity to meet with President Xi in the 80s, but it reminded me when we were talking last time about some of the other people that you were able to meet and tell the Iowa story to about the farm crisis at that time. You mentioned like the Pope or Lech Walesa. And I wondered if you could share some of those stories for people today, some of these high-profile international figures that you were able to tell about the people of Iowa during your time leading the state.
Well, some of you may remember George Mills, who was a writer for the Des Moines Register and then was with the television station. Well, his daughter worked for Governor Edgar in Illinois. And so when Lech Walesa came to Chicago, was hosted by the Polish Consul General, and there's a lot of Poles that live in Chicago. So my wife and I were invited, along with the governor of Michigan and his wife and the governor of Illinois, to be there for that event. And that was special. And we got the book, The Way of Hope, that he wrote, that Lech Walesa wrote. And he was the head of the union there and played a key role in getting freedom for Poland. Of course, Pope John Paul II came here in 1979. Bob Ray was the governor. I was just the lieutenant governor. So I was not in the helicopter with him, I just was in the audience. But then the Archbishop of Dubuque, Bishop Kachera, arranged for us when we were going to be on a trade mission overseas to meet with Pope John Paul II. So my wife and I had a meeting with him, and that was in 1986. So, and he had been here at Living History Farms and talked about agriculture. So during our meeting with the Pope, I was telling him what we were going through. So we're still in the farm crisis in '86, and I was sharing the details about that with Pope John Paul II. He was a fascinating guy. Spoke about 6 languages, and I think was a great leader. And my wife and I have a picture with the Pope in her.
I'm just always so struck by the way that you were always telling the Iowa story to people, whether it was leaders of other countries or leaders of the church, but just always telling that story. And the story of Iowans who were suffering and struggling, it was really striking to me. I'm glad to hear you talk about it again. So.
Well, I would say, I think that's part of the job as governor, is to try to be an advocate for your state and to be understanding and empathetic with people, but also be an advocate for things that will help make things better. And that, it's a great role. That's why I think the ambassador was a great honor. Certainly now being President of the World Food Prize is another honor that I'm very proud of. But, you know, in all those roles, I want to be an advocate for Iowa. And I'm proud to say that a number of Iowans came to visit me when I was ambassador. And I appreciate that. That was wonderful. And in fact, we had one, and my wife says it is one of the best Thanksgivings we ever had. Over 30 people at our residence in Beijing. You know, one of the things is Marcus, he would make a turducken. You know what a turducken is? It's a duck inside a chicken inside a turkey. The only problem is they didn't turn the oven on in time. So we didn't eat till 9:30. But anyway, it was still a great event. So a lot of wonderful memories. You know, the resiliency of the people to me is very amazing. I know we went through a lot of stress and a lot of difficulty, but now I look where we are today, and I think of those things like what John Papajohn did with the entrepreneurial centers, what we did to focus on renewable energy and how that's making a real difference, and now what Governor Reynolds is doing with the focus on making Iowa even more competitive. By the way, if you have never been there, on the back wall is a picture of Norman Borlaug's farm south of Cresco. I have been there. The house is a Sears and Roebuck house that came in on the rail that they assembled. They have moved the one-room country school that he went to that property. And in the barn, they have wood stanchions, and they carved the names of the cows into the stanchions. And in the milk house has got Norman Borlaug's signature. So I'm going to take the whole staff from the World Food Prize to go up and see the Borlaug farm, to know where this great American hero got the Nobel Prize and started the World Food Prize, the humble beginnings that he came from. And of course he developed a strain of wheat that probably saved more than 1 billion people from starvation. So we're in this special room named in his honor, and one of the few people that received all of these awards. Not only the Nobel Prize, but I think the highest honor given by the President of the United States and the Congress.
I think that's a great place to kind of land us, I feel like, right? With Borlaug and the World Food Prize and the resiliency of the people. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing these stories and with us here tonight and throughout the last 6 months or so. It's been really our honor to host and chat with you. Thank you so much.